I'd like to imagine a different world. A world where the Misha Berach that we just sang was unnecessary, where there wasn't pain and there wasn't suffering, where all good people are rewarded, where nothing happens to anyone without a reasonable explanation, where everyone lives to a ripe old age, they all have enough to eat, and everyone always does the right thing. Who's with me on that world? Would you like to live in that world? And then you're thinking to yourself, this is really ridiculous, because we're never going to live in a world like that. On the other hand, if you were to open this week's Torah portion and read the pages, that's the world that our ancestors imagined might one day be. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, you can look, it's called Akev, and you can look it up. It says, basically, if you obey these rules and maintain the covenant, God will favor and bless you, and you'll have enough to eat, and you'll be free of sickness, and your enemies will suffer, and you'll be wealthy. It imagines a utopia. It imagines that fantasy that I described earlier. So it begs the question, then, were our ancestors that naive? Did they really believe? Were they somehow or another more able to believe in a world that we know is impossible? And the answer has to be, of course not. You don't have to live for a few years to know how the world doesn't work. But what the description in Akev was, I think, was it was aspirational. Yes, it was a fantasy, but it was a hopeful fantasy. And the truth is, we get up every morning looking forward to a decent day, hoping on some level that that world, that fantasy world, will maybe just come a little bit closer into our lives. So in some way, we're not that different from them. We long for that ordered, rational world, a world that is free of chaos. In fact, I think we want it so badly that when stuff happens, we struggle to create our own explanations and our own justifications. And often in those explanations and justifications, we end up implicating God as one of the explanations and justifications. So this was evoked by a recent personal experience. I mean, of course, I encounter it all the time as a rabbi, but last Sunday night, my plane was coming in for a nice landing on the runways of LAX, and within yards of the runway, it all of a sudden pulled up and shot off into the Pacific. Now, maybe you've had that experience. I had never had it before. And I turned to the person across from me and I said, we just had a near miss. The person across from me happened to be my wife. And sure enough, the pilot got on the PA and he said, you probably just noticed, and he said this calmly, as pilots do, you probably just noticed that we aborted our landing, but there was traffic on the runway. Now, hidden in that nonchalant traffic on the runway was we almost hit another plane. Now, no doubt, he's the best pilot that I've ever had. Because if he wasn't the best, let's just say I wouldn't have been able to share this story with you. The reality is, life is full of near misses. The teenager who walks away from a serious car accident, the young woman who survives a life-threatening complication in childbirth, the middle-aged man who catches artery blockage before the fatal heart attack. And often it happens after one of life's near misses, and you may have even had your own. Someone might have said to you, God was watching out for you. Or maybe you said to yourself, God was watching out for me. Or maybe you even said, reflexively, and I don't want you to feel guilty for saying this, you said, thank God. In fact, several people said that to me after I told them the story of my near miss. Now, while on the surface, saying thank God or crediting God for our instantaneous salvation appears relatively benign, for someone who happens to be a rabbi and spends a great deal of time thinking about these things, me, it's actually a little bit troubling. Why? Because as many as there are near misses in the world, there are also a lot of direct hits. life is also full of direct hits. And you don't need me to give you a list. You can probably come up with a long list of your own. Now, if God was watching out for me, here's where the near misses and near hits actually have a little problem with each other. If God was watching out for me and the 200 or so other people on that plane, what exactly was God doing when the other plane went down into the Pacific Ocean? If God was watching out for me when my plane had its near miss, where is God when someone doesn't survive an illness? What happens when things go horribly wrong? Is it God administering punishment to those who suffer? After all, that's what the Torah portion seems to imply. We get trapped, I think, in an assumption of a particular kind of biblical theology. And we think that the Torah portion that I just paraphrased earlier for you, Akev, is the current, that's biblical theology. That encompasses all of theology. But what's beautiful about the Bible is that within its pages, and if I were to hold up a Bible, it'd be a lot of pages, there's often disagreement and dissent within the very pages of the Bible itself. The Bible argues with itself, and it's an argument that spans centuries. In fact, the only thing that's actually consistent in the Bible is inconsistency. That's what's in the Bible. So flip a few books farther on past this week's Torah portion, and you find the book of Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes in the Latin version of it. Now, Ecclesiastes was the middle-aged philosopher who says, sometimes a good man perishes in spite of his goodness, and sometimes a wicked one endures in spite of his wickedness. That's in the same book. Contradicts the Torah portion. And he goes on to say, the same fate is in store for all, for the good and pure and for the impure. That is the sad thing about all that goes on under the sun. Tachat Hashemesh, he says, under the sun. In other words, what a Kohelet is seeming to say is that nothing that we do will affect our fate if we find ourselves in the target of a near hit. So Kohelet knew, and I even think the ancient editors of the Bible knew that Akev wasn't the full story. It was just an opening salvo in what is essentially, even to our day, an eternal conundrum. Why do good things and bad things seemingly happen at random? And for centuries, we've been struggling, human beings have been struggling to answer the question. So here's this middle-aged, little older man's conclusion. Most near misses and direct hits are really essentially a matter of luck and logic, or the absence of luck and the presence of logic. Stuff just happens. Why do planes crash? Because they're heavier than air. And when they stop working, they fall out of the sky. And if you happen to be on one of those, it's your unlucky day. People get sick because there are viruses and chemicals and genetic mutations. And if you happen to have one of those, it's incurable, then you know the fate. Houses burn because things that are combustible catch fire. And if you happen to be in one of those houses and not be able to get out, it's bad luck. And I don't mean that trivially. I mean it in the sense that there's no order and direction here. And more often than not, though, and understandably out of deep pain, we ask the question, why did this happen? Why did it happen to me, or why did it happen to my loved one? How can I face tomorrow with the pain in my heart? But when we credit or blame God, what we do is we presume to knowledge that we don't actually have. We take it on ourselves to know how God operates in the world, and we don't know the answer to that question. No one does. No one has the answer. So when I suffer a near miss or a direct hit, I choose to answer a question, I choose to ask a question, rather, that I can at least hazard an answer for. So rather than speculate about one I can, I ask the one that I can perhaps come up with an answer to. So the question that I ask then is, how am I going to be different because of what happened to me? The question I ask is, what will I learn and what will I do now that I am facing or have faced this particular challenge in life? That's a question I can answer. Anyone read the obituary on Glenn Campbell this week? Glenn Campbell answered that question with his life. And he asked it, obviously, and he answered it when he faced a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. He made a powerful statement about his values, and he left a meaningful legacy that actually goes far beyond his music. Because rather than secret himself away and face the inevitable decline away from the public, he continued to appear. And he even performed as the early stages of the disease progressed. And he'd stand up there in front of hundreds, and he'd sing his songs, and halfway through he'd forget the words. But his fingers would remember the music, and so he'd play the music, and the audience would sing the words to him. And they'd cheer and clap because they were supporting him as he faced his illness. Asked to comment on his life in a film that was made, Bill Clinton said that Glenn Campbell's advocacy on behalf of Alzheimer's might actually outstrip his contribution to country music. That's an amazing legacy to leave, because you've asked yourself the question, not why does it happen to me, but what am I going to do about it? How am I going to live my life because I have this burden to bear? So here's the world that I actually do believe we can live in. And a world, I think, and this describes a religion for the 21st century, that we can create. It's a world where people find reason and purpose and order and meaning and value in their lives despite the randomness of human existence. And that from that wisdom that we acquire, we actually discover that peace and fulfillment come not from grasping about for supernatural explanations for things for which there's no explanation, for something or someone to blame, but they come from taking in life's painful lessons. And I'm really clear, they are often extraordinarily painful and overwhelming. But taking in those painful lessons, and through that experience, ultimately becoming better human beings. That's the world I imagine. I hope you'll share it with me.